Yes, the attendance is in the chat box. Davon, how do you pronounce your name? Davon? Davon?
Devon, sir.
Davon?
Devon.
Okay, so let's go to divisible and indivisible obligations and obligation with a penal clause. Okay, so under Article 1223, the divisibility or indivisibility of the things that are object of obligations in which there is only one debtor and one creditor does not alter or modify the provisions of Chapter 2 of this title. Okay, so a divisible obligation is one, the object of which, in its delivery or performance, is capable of partial fulfillment. Okay, and of course, indivisible obligation is one which the object of which, in its delivery or performance, is not capable of partial fulfillment. Okay, so when you say divisible obligation, we can do partial. Okay, partial fulfillment, and we often had the example in the previous meeting, like if it's cash or if it's an object that can be divided or separately fulfilled, then these are divisible obligation. And we also have that indivisible obligation example, like the obligation is a car, you cannot deliver half of the car. Okay, so again, that's divisibility or indivisibility. So the test of the distinction, okay, is in determining whether an obligation is divisible or not divisible. The controlling circumstance is not the possibility or impossibility of partial prestation, but the purpose of the obligation or intention of the parties. Hence, even though the object or service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible if so provided by law or intended by the parties. So, if it is specifically, again, in the previous meeting, we have an example where even if the obligation is money or cash, and you know that cash or money by its nature is divisible, the the divisibility of the obligation or indivisibility of the obligation is not affected. Meaning, if the intention of the parties is for the debtors to actually pay it in whole, then it is indivisible. Okay, even if the nature of the prestation is divisible. Okay. However, if the object is not physically divisible or the service is not susceptible of partial performance, the obligation is always indivisible. The intention of the parties to the contrary notwithstanding. This rule is absolute. So again, if like the example of the example of the car, even if it says that the the debtors are jointly, separately obligated to contribute into purchasing a car and deliver it to the creditor. By the nature of the prestation itself, the car, which is indivisible, you cannot do partial performance and therefore the obligation is still indivisible. Regardless of whether the parties agreed that it is divisible and it is that the debtors are um, jointly or separately liable. Okay? An obligation is presumed indivisible where there is only one creditor and one debtor. Of course, if there's just one debtor and one creditor, it is presumed indivisible. Okay? Hindi siya pwedeng biglang mahahati. Okay. So, kinds of division, qualitative division, quantitative division, and ideal or intellectual division. Okay? So, qualitative division, one based on quality, not on number or quantity of the things that are object of the obligation. Example, A and B are heirs of C, okay, tagapagmana. They agreed to divide the inheritance as follows. To a house and lot and home appliances, and to B, a rice field and a car and 100,000 cash. Okay, so qualitative division based on the quality. Okay. So, yun ba? Tama ba yung pagka-divide? They agreed to divide the inheritance as follows. A house and lot and appliances. And B, rice field, a car, and 100,000 cash. Okay. Palayan yung sa kanya. Palayan plus sasakyan plus 100,000 cash. So that's one way to divide or division, qualitative. Okay, quantitative division, one based on quantity rather than on quality. Here, the quality would be like you cannot compare the other items to the other items. Like house and lot cannot be compared to a rice field, a car, and 100,000 cash. But for fair and equity division, depending on the judgment of the parties, if they have agreed, A and B have agreed as the katagapagmana, as the heirs of inheritance, they can do it by quality, okay, qualitative division. However, in quantitative, okay, rather than quality, if the inheritance consists of only a rice field, it's partitioned by metes and bounds into equal parts is a quantitative division. Okay, example here, if using here that the inheritance is no house and lot, no appliances, only the rice field, then what is meant here by metes and bounds, if say the rice field is 1 hectare, then they will be given 5,000 square meters of the rice field each. That will be an equal division, and the division is based on quantity, but the metes and bounds, okay, of the thing, okay. Another example is when A and B divide 300 kavans of palay harvested from the rice field or the 100,000 cash. So example, if there's a harvest in the rice field of 300 kavans, then if they're going to divide it in quality by quantity, quantitative division, if they're going to share it equally, then they should get each 150 kavans, and each should also get 50,000 pesos for the cash. Okay, that's quantitative division. Another one is ideal or intellectual division, one which exists only in the minds of the parties. Suppose the car and the rice field in the first example were inherited by both A and B. As co-owners, their one-half shares in the car are not separable in a material way, but only mentally, diba? So similarly, before the land is actually divided between A and B, they are merely co-owners, and neither one of them can say that he is absolute owner of a specific portion thereof. So, example, maybe sa car, at the start, ideal or intellectual division, if they're going to really divide the car, one way to divide it, ideally or intellectually, is just really divide maybe the usage, right? You can use MWF, I will be using TTHS, and then Sunday, pahinga yung car, something like that, okay? Or, you can also, so this division is happens only in the mind, okay? So, and then they cannot claim kasi absolute ownership over the thing they have inherited because they know they are co-owners, okay? So those are the three types of division, okay? How about the indivisibility? What are the kinds of indivisibility? We have legal indivisibility, we have conventional indivisibility, and we have natural indivisibility. When you say legal indivisibility, it's where a specific provision of law declares as indivisible obligation, which by their nature are divisible. So, pag sinabi ng batas na indivisible obligation siya, it's indivisible obligation. Conventional, where the will of the parties makes as indivisible. Obligations which, by their nature, are divisible. And natural indivisibility, this one by the nature, okay? As we've previously made an example, okay? Give a particular car, sing a song, and others. Okay, so the nature of the object or prestation itself does not admit of division, does not allow division. Okay, so let's go to Article 1224. a joint indivisible obligation gives rise to indemnity for damages from the time any one of the debtors does not comply with his undertaking. The debtors who may have been ready to fulfill their promises shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the thing or of the value of the service in which the obligation consists. So, most logical though that the one who incurred delay, one of the co-debtors who incurred delay, shall be responsible for the damages. Okay. So, effect of non-compliance by a debtor in a joint indivisible obligation. If any one of the debtors does not comply with his undertaking in a joint indivisible obligation, the obligation is transformed into one for damages, that is, to pay money. The creditor cannot ask for specific performance or rescission because there is no cause of action against the other debtors who are willing to fulfill their promises. Isa lang kasi, or at least one lang unable to comply. In a solidary obligation, the breach by a co-debtor makes all debtors liable for damages. Okay? So, the obligation remains solidary without prejudice to their right against the guilty or negligent debtor. In a joint indivisible obligation, the effect of non-compliance by a debtor is to make all debtors liable for damages, but the innocent debtors shall not contribute beyond their respective shares of the obligation. The obligation becomes a divisible one. Okay, again, balikan natin yung first paragraph. If any one of the debtors does not comply with this undertaking in a joint indivisible obligation. Yung isa, second paragraph, it's a solidary obligation. So, notice the difference in the case. Joint indivisible obligation, if one cannot perform or comply with the obligation, the creditor cannot ask for specific performance or rescission because there is no cause of action against the other debtors who are willing to fulfill their promise. So this one, joint siya, as like our example or an example I gave earlier, if the debtors are jointly obligated to deliver a car, even if like the two debtors are already ready to fulfill the obligation, but if one of the debtors cannot fulfill or cannot comply with the obligation, they will still incur delay, but the obligation cannot be, or the contract cannot be rescinded, or the creditor cannot compel specific performance. Okay, so in this case, okay, the obligation is transformed into one for damages, meaning to pay money. Okay. In solidary obligation, the difference, the obligation remains solidary without prejudice to their right against the guilty or negligent debtor. Everyone is now required to pay because in the eyes of the debtor, any one of them can be made liable because they are solidary debtors. The solidary debtors, however, especially the ones who will be able to pay, okay, the non-negligent parties in the obligation can recover from the negligent debtor or the guilty debtor. The one who caused them to pay damages can recover from that debtor. Okay, but in the eyes of the creditor, he or she can recover from any one of the solidary debtors. That's the very nature of the solidarity of the obligation. Okay, for Article 1225, for the purposes of the preceding articles, obligations to give definite things and those which are not susceptible of partial performance shall be deemed indivisible. Not susceptible of partial performance shall be deemed indivisible. Okay? So when the obligation has for its object the execution of a certain number of days of work, the accomplishment of work by metrical units or analogous things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance, it shall be divisible. However, even though the object or service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible if so provided or intended by the parties. So, if example, in the first paragraph, it says that it is divisible if by the nature of it, it can be performed separately in different times. So, like days of work, okay? If the contract is like 5 days of work, so it is divisible. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. However, if the contract specifically identified that you should be performing this service from day 1 on this specific date, like August 1 to August 5, you should do this. So the intention could be, okay, especially if it is, say, it should be within, or like, you'll do it within the buwan ng wika, okay? The period of which will be August 1 to 31. Although it can be like day 1 to day 31, and it can be performed separately on different dates, you cannot just move some parts of it to September because it is indivisible by the nature of the contract as provided that it should be within the buwan ng wika and it should be daily from August 1 to August 31. And by the letter of the contract, okay, as provided or intended by the parties in the contract, it is indivisible. Even though the tasks can be physically divisible or can be performed separately on different dates. Okay? In obligations not to do, divisibility or indivisibility shall be determined by the character of the prestation in each particular case. So, can be determined by the character of the prestation in each of the particular case. Okay, so when is an obligation deemed indivisible? Okay, as a rule, for determining the divisibility or indivisibility of an obligation, or has been seen, however, the purpose of the obligation is the controlling circumstance. So, it's the controlling circumstance. This rule applies not only to obligations to give, but also to those doing or not doing. Divisible and indivisible obligations are not to be confused with divisible or indivisible contracts. Okay. About obligations to give definite things. To give a particular electric fan, to deliver a specific car, here the obligation is indivisible because the nature of the subject matter. Okay. So this is definite thing, specific thing. So you cannot divide that. Obligations provided by law to be indivisible even if the thing or service is physically divisible. Example, taxes. Okay, although money is physically divisible, the amount of tax payable must be delivered in total, not partially. Okay, so when the computed tax due is 100,000, you cannot just divide it into 5,000 and then say you will pay it in 20 days. As per the tax law, if it's there is a specific date for you to pay your income tax, depending on whether that's a quarterly income tax or an annual income tax. Once the day has arrived, it is due and demandable on the same date. Payment after that date shall consequently have the surcharges, penalties, and interest. So obligations which are not susceptible of partial performance. Example, to sing a song, to dance the tinikling. Okay? Here, the obligation is indivisible by reason of its purpose, which requires the performance of all the parts. Okay? Alangan naman kumanta ka hanggang chorus lang, hindi mo tatapusin. Or baka chorus lang, hindi pwede, di ba? So to sing a song, if that's the contract, then that is indivisible by its nature. Or sumayaw ng tinikling. Pagdating ng kawayan, hindi ka na, you will no longer perform kasi takot ka sa kawayan. It's not allowed because by the nature of it, if it's to dance the tinikling, you have to complete the entire set, the entire routine, or whatever you may call it. Okay? Is the obligation still indivisible if there are more than one participant? The obligation becomes divisible as far as the participants are concerned because it is capable of partial performance. But again, again, it has to go back to the intention of the parties. Although it can be divisible, but you always have to look at the intention of the parties in entering into the contract. Okay? Kasi baka sabihin mo, sir, kung sa halimbawa, 5 pair sila for the tinikling, so pwede palang divisible yun, sir. 3 muna ngayon, tapos the next time, 2, 5 pair. Well, it depends if the contract really specifically allows that. If by the nature of the contract and by the letter of the contract, it says that all 5 must perform on one at the same time, even though it can be possible to be performed by different people and partially, it is if it's the nature of the contract that or the letter of the contract that it is indivisible, it is indivisible. Okay? But again, the obligation becomes divisible as far as the participants are concerned because it is capable of partial performance. Kung halimbawa, 2 na lang talaga ang available na pair dahil yung 3 nagka-COVID or whatever, baka pwedeng partial performance or I don't know, but it should have the consent of the contracting parties in the obligation. Okay? Obligations intended by the parties to be indivisible even if thing or service is physically divisible. Example, the obligation of D to give 1,000 to C on a certain date. So money is physically divisible, but the clear intention here is for D to deliver 1,000 pesos at one time as a whole. Hindi pwedeng pagdating ng sasabihin niya, ay 500 na lang muna, saka na yung 500. If the nature of the obligation is intended for it to be whole, it should be whole. Okay? So it is not divisible, even if it is physically divisible. Suppose there are 2 debtors, D and E. Okay? Is the obligation still indivisible? The obligation becomes divisible as far as D and E are concerned because the delivery of 1,000 can be done in parts, 500 by D and 500 by E. However, as far as C is concerned, the obligation remains indivisible because its performance cannot be done in parts. Again, D intended to receive, C intended to receive 1,000 at the date. Okay? At the date specified. So it is still indivisible. Even if the prestation is capable of physical divisibility. So, in the second example, as far as D and E is concerned, it is divisible because they can take parts, right? They can have their own portions. But as far as C is concerned, he or she cannot be compelled partial performance and therefore he can demand the entire amount in one and the same time, okay, at a specified date. Okay? So, obligations deemed divisible. Obligations have for their object the execution of a certain number of